do software and service and so forth. And so got a few books. The latest one we've seen out here, Surveying the User Experience, but the broad topic we'll be talking about today first is going to be about quantifying the user experience. So we're going to draw on a number of these books that Jim and I have written a lot in common and some individually there as well, largely about measuring the user experience. But I just want to say before I get going, I'm happy to be out here. Part of the ethos of our company, Measuring You, you'll notice our logo down here has a little M in it. In the US, of course, we call it a mu. And came up with this a long time ago to sort of talk about how quantifying is really at the heart of what we do, but part of the challenge of bringing quantification to a field like UX is, I think, a certain intimidation that people have about using statistics. And there's a bit of a expression in the US that if people don't understand it, it's Greek to them. It means that they don't quite understand it. So I couldn't think of a better way that showing how approachable Greek is by actually coming out to Greece and hanging out with the people of Greece as well here, and showing that everybody's really quite friendly here as well here too. So bringing statistics, making it understandable and approachable is part of the ethos of what we do at Measuring You. And here are the three things that we're going to talk about, broad topics. One, how does one measure the user experience, largely to track changes over time to designs? What role do surveys have in UX? How does that fit into product development? And then finally, the perennial controversial topic of sample sizes. We'll talk about different ways that one calculates sample size and take a little of the mysticism out of it. Okay, so let's talk about quantifying the user experience. There is no magic UX thermometer that we can stick into something to just measure it. Instead, the user experience it's a combination of what we think and what we do, or attitudes and actions. And so you can see in this diagram here, it's one way to think about it too is also perception and performance. So it's the intersection of these actions and these attitudes, and our attitudes affect those actions. So when we want to quantify the user experience, we need some way of actually measuring both attitudes and actions. So how does one do that? Well, there's at least 70 ways that you can measure the user experience, and you've got this infographic we have on our website as well, and we've done a course on many of the metrics that you might encounter when going about measuring the user experience. But you'll see that they fall into the broad rubric of actions and attitudes. So attitudes and actions are largely what we're doing, how we quantify that user experience. And it can get a little bit overwhelming, but what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is this large segmentation when we're dealing with attitudes and actions are measured at what are called the task level or at the study level. So when we're at the task level, this is more traditional, like what you would see in a usability test. We're asking somebody to try and accomplish a particular task or a scenario just like you would if somebody wasn't watching. And the three most important metrics, we call them the big three, are a combination of effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. So this is what people do and what people think. Can people complete the task? How difficult do people think the task? This is something called the single ease question that we use to measure that. It's a 7-point rating scale. And then time, efficiency. And you'll see those are based on the international standard 9241 part 11 that's been around quite a while. I think folks are pretty familiar with this, this concept of measuring usability and user experience so far, right? So those are the big three that you're going to keep in mind as we're measuring. And as we think about quantifying over time, we'll be using those at the task level. Then we get into the study level. This is where we're getting more into that larger circle of attitudes. These are measured just once, whereas typically when we've got a participant who we want to assess the user experience of an interface, we'll give them multiple tasks. Can they complete it? How long does it take? Do they think it's difficult? Now we'll often repeat that over and over, say over an hour period with a participant. But at the end of that session or a study, we'll typically ask one or a number of these particular measures here, some of which you might be more familiar with than others. So I'm just going to touch on a couple today. Who's familiar with the system usability scale, the SUS? Okay, so SUS makes sense. It's been around for quite a while. The SUS, the system usability scale, it's one of the oldest ways, not the oldest, but one of the oldest ways that we measure perceive ease of use. It's a 10-item scale. It's what's been considered technology agnostic, meaning you can measure it on websites, on software, on mobile apps. But it's a little redundant with 10 items. It's only measuring one thing, ease. So over time, we created something called the Super Q, which was an extension of the SUS, but specifically for websites. So you can actually generate a SUS score for websites, but also measures of trust, appearance, and loyalty as well. So that's more specific for websites. More recently, Jim and I have come up with something called the UX Lite, or the User Experience Lite Questionnaire. This is, we'll talk about this shortly, but this is also an extension of the SUS. It's only 2 items. It's an evolution of the UX. Are you all familiar with the UX and UX Lite? I believe this was referenced in an earlier talk. Somebody was talking about the UX. But we'll talk about the UX Lite here shortly. And then the Net Promoter Score. Many organizations use the Net Promoter Score as this measure of behavioral intention. You can compute the Net Promoter Score out of the Super Q. Net Promoter Score gets a lot of strong opinions, let's say, both for and against it. And we don't necessarily recommend you start using it or stop using it, but rather most organizations who are using it, it becomes a very important common denominator of communication, and it becomes important to show how user experience metrics can affect the Net Promoter Score, which hopefully is loosely tied to that business itself, its measures. Whether it is or not is, I think, another question. But we'll talk a little bit about that as well here. So I mentioned the User Experience Lite Questionnaire. So if you're not as familiar with it, it's just 2 items, and you administer this on any type of product. So it's like the SUS. You can use it on websites, you can use it on software, you can use it on prototypes. And it's got 2 items. It's got ease, and it's got the second item, which is a measure of usefulness. So we're going to talk about why those 2. But the UX Lite, it's super compact. If you're familiar with the UX Lite, the main modifications that you can see there is we shrank it from 7-point to 5-point because a lot of organizations were using the system usability scale, this 10-item questionnaire. So if you added 1 additional item, if the product or the software meets my needs, it gets you these 2 aspects, ease and usefulness. And we'll talk about why those 2 matter here shortly. A lot more on the UX Lite if you're not familiar with it on our website, so I've got some mention of that up there. So what's neat about the UX Lite is super compact. It's valid and reliable. We talk about that at length on the website. And then you can look at a product on a scatter plot. You can see how useful and how usable a product are. So as it turns out, if you want people to start using a product or a technology, what's called technology acceptance, 2 key ingredients there are the product has to meet your needs. It has to do what you want it to do. When you think about products that you use every day, an app or a physical product, it's got to accomplish a particular goal. It turns out that simple question, it meets my needs, it does a pretty good job of actually capturing people's attitude towards usefulness. So a product's got to be useful, but it's also got to be easy to use. So these 2 things end up being the key ingredients for technology acceptance. Okay, so a little bit going on here in this particular graph, but when we think about attitudes and actions, it becomes a little more challenging to think about why and how do our attitudes, how do we measure them, and how do they actually predict our behavior? And this is actually a question that's been around for quite a while. This top graph up here, which you can see comes back from the 1960s. Early on, especially some of the early work in survey design, people wanted to know, well, how do our attitudes actually, how can we predict people's behaviors through our attitudes? And there's this simple model called the theory of planned behavior that basically found, and it was repeatable, that we have attitudes that affect our behavioral intentions. What are behavioral intentions? Things like, I intend to purchase a product. I intend to go to Greece. I intend to recommend something. So those are my behavioral intentions, and behavioral intentions tend to be better predictors of actual behavior. They're not perfect predictors. So what happens is we form an attitude, generally a favorable attitude towards something or an unfavorable attitude. If I don't like something, I'm probably not going to do it. And if I don't want to do it, I'm not going to do it. So this becomes the foundation for a lot of the framework for how we go about measuring the user experience, why we measure attitudes, and how those can predict actions. So there's that model I alluded to, something called the technology acceptance model that you can see it's been around for quite a while. Davis came up with this. Attitudes toward usefulness and ease of use affect our intention to use, and they showed that it actually longitudinally does predict whether or not people will use software products. So this is one of the first instances where the theory of planned behavior was applied to software development. So The technology acceptance model, the items that they used in a particular questionnaire, there was like 12 of them, it was quite lengthy. We wanted to replicate some of these findings, and what we actually found was the UX Lite, the 2-item questionnaire, did as good, if not a better job of actually predicting future usage of software products than the longer technology acceptance model. And see, when we go about developing a questionnaire or an instrument, it's not just Jeff said to use this or Jim said to use this, but what we want to do is to go through the process of validation. Is it actually measuring what we intended to measure? How do we know that people's attitudes towards ease and usefulness are meaningful? Well, because it predicts, as we found, actual usage. So the model down below, which we're talking about some of these measures, shows different ways of measuring ease of use using the system usability scale, the SEQ, or just one item of the UX Lite. The SuperQ has many of those items in common as well. We have multiple studies that have shown when we measure at one point in time what people's attitudes towards the ease of the software product is that they're using, and then we go and measure them 30, 60, or 90 days later, they are actually using it more, they're recommending it more. So that's how we measure that, that's how we validate that. So it's just showing you some justification or linkage between our attitudes, behavioral intentions, and behaviors. So there's more information on the site about that. Other ways that we've shown that linkage that becomes important if you're working with an organization that does use the Net Promoter Score, for example, we've consistently found strong correlations between attitudes towards the ease of use of software. People think the software is easy to use, they're more likely to recommend it. And this is from one of our internal reports here where we show products like AutoCAD, Photoshop, iTunes, Dropbox, those are the SUF scores. Higher attitudes towards ease lead to higher likelihood to recommend. So this is, again, a clear link. Net Promoter Score is a behavioral intention. Attitudes towards ease affects that behavioral intention, which ultimately predicts actual referral, actual purchase rates. So far, so good? Feel good about that? So again, we're sort of covering a lot of territory here all at once, but just thinking about quantifying the user experience. Measures of attitudes, measures of actions. The UX Lite does a good job of measuring those attitudes. When we also think about metrics, one of the challenges that when I work with organizations and talk with folks is how do these measures fit together and how you pick. And I think it's important to think of many UX metrics on this causal chain as we saw before. Your ultimate output that most organizations care about are people using the product? Are they purchasing the product? Are they spending more on the product? Are they recommending it to friends? But these are lagging measures. By the time you collect that data, a lot of things have already happened. So what you want to know is, well, what's going to predict if people use something, if people recommend something, if people purchase it? So you go back in time and you see that's why the Net Promoter Score was so popular, because it was advertised as something that could predict growth rates through recommending. But many of these UX measures both connect to the Net Promoter Score and then ultimately go to that outcome measures of purchase rates and so forth. But when you go all the way back, you'll see just observing users with a particular product. Did they have a problem? Was there a problem in the interface? Those problems in the interface affect whether or not people can complete the task. The problems in the interface affect how long it takes people. It affects how difficult. That in turn affects how easy people think a product is, whether they're recommending it, and that in turn ultimately affects whether or not people purchase, recommend it, or reusing it. So oftentimes organizations will have just one or two of these measures and not sure how they fit together. So it's also helpful to think about both attitude and action measures on this causal chain. Good on that one? Good? Okay. Another example just touching on how the user experience is associated with actual business metrics over time. This was an example where we were working with a mobile phone manufacturer years ago. And in the United States, at least, when you purchase your mobile phone, you have 2 weeks till you can return it back to the store if you don't like it, if it was a problem. Now, this is right when the iPhone was coming out. But as you can imagine, purchasing a phone, returning it to your store is quite expensive for the store. So they did not want people returning their phone and having to restock it and repackage it. So they want to know, can we predict return rates? So we used dozens of measures, how it felt in people's hands, their attitude towards the ease of use, series of functions, a lot of ergonomic measures. And it turned out the SUS was one of the strongest predictors of return rates. So what we found is when they were measured in the lab early on, if the SUS score was below average, so 68 is the average SUS score for those who are familiar or not familiar with it. If the SUS score on a phone was below average, you had about a 24% return rate. As soon as you got on the higher end, higher attitudes towards ease, the return rate went down to 10%. So you could actually see how people's attitudes towards ease and the actual ease of use, could people figure out the phone, did they have problems with it? It predicted return rates. It's pretty helpful. It's a good, easy way to measure something that ultimately has a large impact. We good about, so far so good? Everybody's ready to go out and start measuring the user experience? All right, very good. So I think I'm going to talk about a few more things, and then we'll have plenty of time to keep this interactive and answer questions, or you can disagree with me or come up with some other ideas that you want to talk about as well here too. So, okay. So talking about surveys now, we've got the 4 years in the making, this book that Jim and I wrote, because there's a lot of also controversy. Surveys have been around for quite a while. Surveys are used in a lot of fields, and they have a specific use in user experience, although a number of, I think people wonder, isn't surveying the user experience a bit of an oxymoron? Isn't the whole point to observe the user experience? Why would you survey it? But what's important to keep in mind is that when you think about what methods do user experience researchers use, this comes from the International User Experience Professionals Association's survey from 2022. It's going to be updated again this year, asking what methods do professionals use. This was about 70, data came about 70% from the US and 30% from other countries as well here too. So you can see surveys are certainly up there as one of the most used methods. So whether or not we want to or not, surveys are used extensively in our field. But what's important is that even when it's not the specific method, interviews, in-depth interviews, who runs in-depth interviews with users here? Yeah. And who runs usability testing here as well too? Very common. The process by which you select and qualify your participants for a usability test or an interview often starts with a survey. How the questions are asked, rating scales. So even when it's not the particular method, surveys become an important gateway by which we measure the user. So it seems pretty important that we address some of the common concerns that people have, specifically about rating scales, and that's the large contribution that this book has. So I have to put some Greek references in here wherever I could here. A lot of concerns that people first have when they talk about surveys and using it in the user experiences. What about bias? What about the errors? Aren't people going to just answer however I want them to answer? And that certainly can be the case, but most of the time when we think about the very memorable errors, if we think about election polls or attitudes towards certain social actions, they're somewhat controversial. People have strong opinions about that. But when we move towards attitudes toward the user experience, what we find is when we're surveying people, it's about their usage of a product, their attitudes towards a product. What we found over time is that modifications don't nearly matter as much when people don't have as strong of opinion or necessarily a controversial attitude or a socially desirable attitude towards a particular product. So those biases are important, but when we reviewed hundreds of surveys for this book, as we look about how rating scales were used in those surveys, how questions were asked, it was not the biases in the questions themselves that were the most glaring errors. It was really simple things on how questions were asked, just common mistakes. I just took a couple examples here of what we typically see. Are you planning to buy anything listed below within the next 6 months? You could see something like this would be used in a screening survey for an interview. Well, the problem is, well, what if you're buying a sofa, a mattress, and a kitchen dining table? It's kind of phrased a little bit weird. So I guess you would pick one. But what about this one? Do you have any children that reside with you in the following age ranges? Well, I have 3 kids, and I guess I have to just pick one of them in this particular case here. So simple issues like this, as you can see, this only allows you to select one. There's not letting you select multiple ones. These are by far the most common issues we see with surveys, not that a small change in a rating scale is going to lead to dramatically different results. It's that just simple mistakes that can be avoided often just from a quick pre-test, running with a few participants. You'll find a lot of these, or even having some people QA those. So that's one of the first issues. The next thing that we do in the book, again, the biggest contribution we did to surveying the user experience is When Jim and I reviewed the literature on surveys, we were surprised how many recommendations there were that were based upon quite. Even in the published literature, many of the studies were confounded, meaning a researcher for doing public opinion would test labels on rating scales, but at the same time they would test the orientation of the scale and say the color of the scale. And unless the experiment was properly balanced, those findings end up being confounded or biased, so you actually couldn't disentangle those. So that was very unfortunate for us because we had read these studies, we wanted to give a recommendation in our book, and because the data was confounded, we needed new data and it didn't exist. So we ended up spending 4 years basically funding a lot of studies to try and come up to see what would happen when we would modify particular results. And what do I mean by that is, what happens if you use stars on your rating scale instead of numbers? Isn't that going to dramatically change your results? Well, we ran several experiments and we found it only changed the results by about 1%, 1.3%. Well, what if we use negative numbers? Some people say you should use negative numbers in your rating scale. How does that change your results? 0.7%. We're talking hundreds of participants. We would randomly assign people, typically sometimes with negative numbers or sometimes with positive numbers. Or what if you were to use the word extremely, the English word extremely, or versus very? Very small effect there. Or what happens if you have a vertical presentation versus a horizontal presentation? So you'll notice a couple things with this graph. The very first thing is most of the effects that come up have very little or no statistically significant effect. And when they do, they're really quite small. So what that means is if you were to change your rating scale, say from 5 to 7 points, the number of points here, yeah, there's going to be a little bit of a difference, but it's really usually quite modest. Now, it's not always the case. You'll notice on the far end of the scale here, we did detect, in some cases, very large effects, and these are things that you want to be careful of. The biggest one on the left there is what happens. Everybody's familiar with the Net Promoter Score? Okay. So Net Promoter Score is based upon an 11-point, 0 to 10-point scale, likelihood to recommend. Well, there was a lot of bad recommendations going around that would say just use a 3-point scale instead because we're converting 11-point responses to promoters, passives, and detractors. Why not just give people 3 points? Well, the problem with that is you're taking people who have an extreme positive or an extreme negative attitude and you're squishing them together with people who only have a very tepid. Sure, I'll recommend to, yes, I definitely will recommend, are no longer differentiated in your data. And what that does is result in scores that are often 22 percentage points different, quite substantial. So this leads to our recommendation number one of generally we don't recommend 3-point scales because it's the extreme responders in your scales that tend to be the best predictors of behavior. Those with the most strong attitude, the extreme responders, very favorable or unfavorable, are much more likely to actually follow through on those actions. But when you only use 3 points, yes, no, maybe, happy, neutral, sad, for example, you're not able to differentiate that. So that was the first effect there. The second effect we noticed was just one that's been replicated quite a bit in the survey literature, and that is there are cultural effects when you use rating scales. Now, we tested specifically US versus Japan, France, and Germany. And they were rating scales, the Singalese questions, satisfaction questions that were translated into French, translated into German, and translated into Japanese. We saw the largest differences between, and the differences here is generally how people in certain cultures do or don't select the highest response, the middle response, or the lowest response. Participants, in particular certain Asian countries, we found it in Japan, are very adverse from picking the very most favorable response in a scale. So they tend to stay more towards the middle. To some extent, we also saw this in Germany. Now, we didn't measure Greek scales. We didn't measure other scales. But I suspect there can be certain cultural effects, not just with the translation, but just how people in a particular region orient themselves when presented with 5, 7, or 11 numbers. Now, what that means is it doesn't mean don't use rating scales in certain cultures. It means be careful when you're doing cross-cultural comparisons because the differences that you're seeing are often just how people interpret those particular scales. But for the most part here is what you can see is rating scales matter, but usually not that much. So when you're using a rating scale in a survey, don't get too bent out of shape knowing things might differ, or if your boss or a stakeholder or somebody says, I want to use a 7-point scale or I want to use a 5-point scale, it's usually not worth the argument there as long as you're consistent. Did I convince you on that one so far? Everybody feels good? Yeah, maybe? So we have excruciating detail about all these studies in the book with many references, so then you can see and attempt to replicate as well there. So building on what I just said, we'll often get asked, well, how many points do you recommend in a scale, Jeff and Jim? And we don't have a lot of strong opinions if you're consistent, with the exception of probably that 3-point scale that we mentioned. If you're going to use a rating scale to measure somebody's attitude, 3 is generally not enough. There are some exceptions if you're using many, many, many items and you're averaging those all together, but even then it's probably not going to be sensitive enough. But usually if you're using rating scales, we encourage you to use fewer because you don't want to be burdening the user with too much time. And then you can see as the number of points go up, we have slightly different recommendations there. So when you're using, like with the SUS, it's a 5-point scale because again, it's got multi-items. We use it with the Super Q and the UX Lite. As the number of items you have goes down, so even when you're down to 1 item, the number of points matters more. So you'll get a little bit more discrimination. Again, we're talking sensitivity differences of 1, 2, 3%. So there's a benefit when you use more points, but it's not so dramatic that if you use fewer that it's useless. So there we go. Survey rating scales, feel good about that? Ready? Okay. So last topic we'll touch on. This one is a lot of, people think there's a lot of magic and there's some math to this, but there's some assumptions based in sample sizing. But there's a lot of misunderstandings about sample sizes. I've got the Propolis in the background there. So when probably every week we get asked, what sample size do you use? What sample size should we use? What sample size should we use for our study? And the first answer we give is based upon this basic rubric here with 3 branches. The sample size you need when you're planning a UX study is based upon which one of these 3 things are you trying to do. Are you trying to uncover problems in an interface? This is the classic usability test. I want to know what the problem is and I want to fix it. You're embarking on something called problem discovery. And this is mathematically modeled one way. You're trying to uncover if something exists. We'll talk about that. The other 2 ways are typically what you see in surveys. You're trying to estimate the sentiment in a population. What are people's attitudes towards the ease? If I just measure 20, 30, or 40 people, how well does that reflect the 10,000 or the 100,000 or the million people that I can't measure? That's a second way that we go about computing sample sizes. And then the third way is, are you making a comparison? Are you comparing people's attitudes now to how the attitudes were before? Are you comparing users' attitudes towards one product against another product? And now you have sampling error in 2 distributions that have to be accounted for. So this one requires the largest sample size, the next largest sample size, and the smallest sample size. So the very important distinction you think about when we're thinking about sample sizes, what are you really trying to do? And once you go down this, it's really going to help solve, and we have some tables that you can use and how we come up with this we'll talk about here. So, okay, I believe you guys had my friend Jacob Nielsen on a few months ago as well to talk. Okay, good. So who has seen this article from Jacob's old website, Why You Only Need to Test with 5 Users? Yeah, familiar with this one? So this came, which part? Fair enough. He doesn't say only 5 users. So where did it come from, or where does this sort of notion come from? Now, if you go back to his article, you'll see a graph that looks something like this. Basically, as the number of users increases, the percent of problems found also increases, and so you've got this point on the graph where 85% basically crosses. Now, if you scroll down in the article a little bit, you'll see. Most people don't scroll down. Most people don't read because now we start getting into a little bit of the math and it starts getting a little bit confusing here. But if you scroll down, Jacob, where did he come up with this particular thing? So he says, N is the total number of usability problems, L is the proportion of usability problems discovered, and the typical value of L is 31% averaged across a large number of projects we study. And that's the key ingredient in that 5 users recommendation. The 31% means is if a problem affects roughly 1/3 of all your users, 31%. Now, you don't know it exists, but let's say there's a problem in your software that 1 out of 3 people have. If you were to test 5 users selected from that group, you're going to have an 85% chance of seeing that problem at least one time. Now, that's not very controversial. That is just working backwards from the math. If something happens 31% of the time, it's a very common problem. You don't need a very large sample size. Where did Jacob come up with 31%? At the time, he asked people, including Jim, my colleague, to provide data sets of usability tests in the 1990s, and they looked at how common usability problems were across a number of studies, and they found that the average problem was about 31%. Now, again, this is not controversial, the math. Where it becomes controversial is 31% the right number to use? Is it always the right number to use? And understanding that nuance is very important. So that article referenced earlier work that Jacob and Tom Landauer did in 1993, but you'll notice across multiple papers here, going all the way back to Bob Viertzi, they are all talking about the same formula. Now, Nielsen used a slight different derivation, but it's the same formula. It's just a different starting point. They all use the same formula derived from the binomial probability formula. So even some of the folks who are most critical of the 5 users, Spool and Schroeder, for example, also use the formula. The big controversy is, well, how common should we assume problems are? In each of these papers, they looked at different data sets and found a sort of average of how common the problems are. The Nielsen one, again, found 31% and average in 11. My colleague Jim, when he replicated it across a data set, the problem occurrence was much lower. And then in this particular paper from Spool and Schroeder, the problem occurrence was much, much lower, a problem occurrence of only 3%. So you need a much larger sample size in order to have a better chance of detecting those problems. But there's high agreement on this formula. The concern, though, is like, well, what do we use for a value of P, and what does this even mean? So I try to come up with just a little bit of math before we have some alcohol and eat and something like that. So bear with me here, just a little math today. Here's how that's derived. That formula basically means the chance of detecting a problem, if it exists, all that goes in the formula is the probability of occurrence, and then that little thing up the top is an n. That's the sample size. So that'll tell you the probability of the chance of detecting. If you go back and use a little bit of algebra, you can move these around. You do have to use logarithms, which gets everybody all confused. But when you shift this around and we want to solve for n instead of the chance of detecting, it becomes this formula here, just log 1 minus the chance of detecting a log probability of occurrence here. So an 85% chance of detecting a problem that occurs 31% of the time requires 5.11 people, so 5, maybe 6 people you would use there. Math is not controversial, it's that value of P, how common problems are. And what we recommend is look at your particular interface. Is this an interface that that has never gone through any testing, that you expect it to have a large number of problems or a lot of potential problems? The value of your P, of your problems, is probably much higher. If this is an interface that's gone through a lot of testing, say it's a public-facing website that's used by millions of people daily and it's a core flow, it probably doesn't have many very obvious or common usability issues, so the value of P is very low in that case. So I just give you some examples of, I'll show ahead here, just to give you some idea of the P, and then we'll use the sample size table. So probability of occurrence. Basically, as the probability of occurrence gets higher, as the problems become more common, your sample size goes down. So I've used that formula, and I've got some examples of how this comes into play. So back in the 2000 election in the United States, there was some controversy. The Palm Beach County, Florida ballot looked like this. And you can't quite see it from here, but the problem was the way that this was designed by somebody who really wanted to make this easy for people who are older to actually select the presidential candidate. But the problem was a number of people apparently selected the wrong candidate as they went across, a usability issue. Afterwards, they estimated something like 1 in 10 voters potentially had this problem. Well, would 5 users be enough to have detected that? Turns out that P is too low in that case. When you use that formula, you need about 18 people to have an 85% chance of seeing that voting problem at least one time. That's a relatively low value of P. In another example, we were working with AutoCAD, Autodesk. Are you familiar with AutoCAD, the architecture company? Part of what they did, this was published a few years ago, students would often download the software in architecture school for free, install it, and then after time they would use it and pay for it. There was a problem with the download process, and the customer support was saying we're getting a lot of problems, but we're not quite sure why. The user experience team was able to observe, have people download and install this, and they were watching a couple, I think a dozen people, 12 or 14 people to do this. Well, after doing that, it turned out the reason is that people were selecting the wrong operating system as they were going through, and they didn't know halfway through. That problem affected about 28% of people who were installing. Now, some of those people knew what the problem was, and they were able to go back, but some people didn't. That problem affected about 28%. That was our estimate, about 28% of the users. If a problem affects 28% of your users, after observing 6 people, there's a really good chance you have seen it at least one time. We're just using the formula. This comes from seat selection on airline. I don't know how Aegean, how do you select seats on airlines? This same kind of, you have these little seat maps. You know, this came from a report we did a couple years ago. It was really quite confusing. When you selected the seat, it would keep unselecting it in this really unusual way, and it affected a lot of people, and a lot of people had problems. Now, we didn't know if it was intentionally nefarious to make people spend more or not get a seat selected, but we found 59% of people had this particular problem. This is a very high problem occurrence. It was really frustrating. Only need 3 people, and you would see that problem at once. Now, what's happening when you all go out to test, of course you don't know if the problem exists, right? If the problem exists, you would go fix it. But let's assume a problem affects more than half your users. If that actually is the case, after 3 people, you're gonna see that. And then Jim, in a sort of famous study he did for IBM, back when you would buy printers, they would, this is in the 1980s, they would ship you a printed out manual of how to install the software with the printer. They noticed a problem with the installation instructions that people were having, and the product designer said, don't worry, we'll just print out this errata sheet that will stick on top of the printer that says, do this first, that will fix the problem. And so Jim said, okay, I'm gonna run a few participants in the lab, and he watched as 6 out of 8 people just took that piece of paper and threw it aside and incorrectly installed the software. 75% problem rate there. Yeah, and rounding up, you'd only need 2 people, and he would have seen it. And now, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed. There's only 85% chance of seeing that once. So again, the theme here, as something is more frequent, the smaller the sample that you need. So finally, if I wanted to get a really good Greek salad, come to Greece all the time. The Greek salads are so good. This is what we dream about. Greek salads are so good. How many Greek restaurants would I need to go to in order to have at least one good Greek salad? Now, I think there are probably a couple restaurants out there that don't have good Greek salads, right? So I'm going to assume that the prevalence of good Greek salads is about 95%. So I really only need to go to one restaurant to have an 85% chance of seeing that Greek salad once. Trying to just bringing that home here. So thinking about Greek salads. Everybody feel good about probability of occurrence? Beating this. So if we go back to this table here, that's the concept behind it. So we do all the math for you, so then you'll see these tables. P is problem frequency. As the frequency of the problem goes up and your sample size goes up, you're almost surely going to see that particular problem or set of problems. That 5 users issue comes in around here, the 31%, 5 people, it gets in at 85%. So anytime you want to use the sample size here, the chance of detecting it, we work it all out. So at a sample size of 10, you can see it's going to be very rare for you to detect problems that only affect 1% or 5%. But you would be able to see most problems that affect most people. So the main qualifier for the Nielsen article that people mess up is you only need to test with 5 users if the probability of occurrence is high. So 5 users won't cover most of the most common problems. Most of the most common problems. Not all of the most common problems, and not all problems. And that's where people mess up. They'll say 5 users uncovers all problems, and it doesn't. Okay, did we beat that one enough? Is that good? All right, everybody feels good? Okay, still talking about food here, I guess, for some reason. You get hungry. All right, so the second branch we're going down after problem detection is thinking about sampling, particularly for surveys. And the way to think about sampling for precision is like cooking. When you want to know, is the soup done? Is it too spicy? Is it too hot? It doesn't matter how large your pot is, assuming it's stirred up pretty well, you're going to take a little sample, and a little sample of that turns out to be reasonably good prediction of what's in the larger pot. There's a large diminishing return that happens, of course, as you sample and sample more. And that's the same concept that applies to precision. Now, I've hit you guys up with enough math today, so we're not going to do any more formulas. We have those in the book and on the website. But the book also does something, it's an important contribution that we made as well. And Jim and I, writing this book, we reviewed over 100,000 responses for rating scales. And what we found was rating scales have a particular predictable pattern of variability. And variability is one of the key ingredients of how you compute the sample size for precision. So when you come to typical tables, if you were to go on the internet and say, what sample size do I need for a survey, they're using an assumption that you're going to be making a binary measure. Did people say yes? Did people say no? Did people agree? Did people disagree? That's the binary measure. It's the coarsest measure. It's the sort of fundamental unit of measurement, binary. It requires the largest sample size, especially if you think roughly half the people are going to say yes or half the people say no. And it means sample sizes have to be quite large. The way to read these tables is, for example, if I want a 10% margin of error, if I was using a binary sample size, I would need roughly 65 people. So then I would have plus or minus 10%. With rating scales, though, because there's more levels of gradation that you're able to measure, 5, 7, 11 points, we're able to capture the attitude, the sentiment, whatever is being measured more precisely than a binary measure. And the result is you need roughly only about a quarter of the sample size. About a quarter of the sample size. So for that same survey, the same level of precision, if you're using a rating scale, you'd only need 19 people is what that's saying on the one side there. Same thing applies when making comparisons in these tables. When you have a binary measure, if I want to know, is there at least a 10% difference in one of those metrics? Can 50% of people complete the task on product A and can spend at least 60% on product B? So that's a 10% difference, 50% on one, 60% on the other. You would need 307 people in each group in order to detect that difference with binary data. If you're using a rating scale, do users on product A think it's easier than users on product B? It's a more precise measure. You would only need 79 users in each group in that case. So you can't get away of needing a larger sample size when you're making comparisons or precision, but what this is showing is that rating scale data tends to give you some benefit. So using those both in a survey certainly can be helpful. And then this is just finally a quick table that shows you again that just everything sort of combined at once. As your sample size goes up, so what we'll often do is say, how much budget, how much time is there for what sample size you have? Here's how precise you can be. So at a sample size of 50, plus or minus 11% for binary data, plus or minus 6% for rating scale data, and you can detect 13 percentage point differences for rating scales and 24% for binary data. That's the third branch. Not usually as controversial as the first branch, problem discovery, but what also confuses people is just because you're running UX research or doing a usability test, the 5-user or the problem discovery is not going to apply for everything. If you're trying to estimate all your users, you're going to have to deal with the estimated precision, and these are confidence intervals worked backwards, and the comparisons are 2 sample t-tests and 2 proportion tests for those who are interested. But that's what I got for today. Just covered a little broad swath of everything. If you want to learn more, we do a boot camp every year. Right now it's virtual, but I got to meet Sotiris there a few years ago in person at our boot camp, where we spend some time together. And then, of course, we've got the book and we've got courses online at Measuring You as well. And we talked about our particular books there. And I'll come back to this, but that's the pre-recorded material for today. And thank you. Plenty of times for lively discussions and chat.
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions from the audience? Live or via Zoom? Go nuts, man.
I'm not going anywhere.
I have a question. Like Dr. John Pagones.
All right, Dr. John.
So I asked Tim about this, and he told me to ask you, so I'm doing this. Yeah. So you had this online webinar, 3 webinars about the NPS, and in there you did a study, a 5 years retrospective study, where you were looking at the companies and how they fared in the stock market based on the NPS scores, and you demonstrated that if they do well with NPS, then the likelihood is that they will do good in terms of revenue and in the stock market. No, actually, it was in terms of revenue. So, yeah, so you had a good predictor of effectively revenue performance, a business doing well. So it's good for investment if you can actually measure the NPS correctly, not in a fluffy way. So how come you haven't published this? It's only on videos.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one only has.
Maybe you want to explain what the study is about.
So what we did exactly right is again, lots of strong opinions, not a lot of data on the Net Promoter Score. The original data that came out of the Net Promoter Score came from Reichheld, and they also didn't publish a lot of that. They wrote it in their book, and in the Harvard Business Review article, but it was not easy to track. And so a number of other authors had written articles very critical of the Net Promoter Score. And I think this is also an example of maybe where the hype gets a little bit ahead of the actual validity of the particular measure. So what we did in that case is, we had a few research assistants go through dozens of data sets. And it turns out what made it really challenging was it's not just revenue in many cases. In certain industries, how they measure success is not revenue. So for example, in retail, they use same-store sales because many large retailers will open up new stores every year. And so the revenue naturally starts getting bigger and bigger, but it doesn't mean that the actual process of opening stores and the brand is actually becoming more profitable in that case. And so you actually have to look at more revenue, you have to look at profit.
Και είναι το πατίνι και πάλι ζεσταίνομαι.
Oh, it's okay.
Λοιπόν,
It gets everybody excited talking about the Net Promoter Score. So we looked back at that, and what we found was, you're right, when it was measured properly in aggregate, we found that it correlated. So the Net Promoter Score, we used one published data sets for people's Net Promoter Score, separate data sets, publicly available data sets for revenue and products, and then we showed the correlation. But the important distinction is the correlation was there, but it was modest. It was about a 0.38. What that means is that our measure of likelihood to recommend was only explaining about 18% of the variation in company performance. So it established that it's predictive in some way, but it's not extremely strong, number one. And number two, we are not making, and we certainly didn't make any claims or saw the causal relationship. Because it could be that products and companies that are more successful just tend to generate people who are more likely to recommend. As opposed to if people are more likely to recommend, it generates a more successful product or company there. So, but the important thing is we definitely found that link in the Net Promoter Score. But why haven't we published it? I guess we should get around to publishing it. One gets a little tired of writing about those things every now and then. But yeah, not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. Yeah. Next question on that one.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for being here. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it all made sense. So I kind of have a more specific question in a way. First of all, I'm Argyris, and I work as a UX data analyst for a SaaS company that specializes in recruitment. It has a recruitment platform called Workable. So my question is, let's say we have 0 UX-related metrics, right? Where would you start measuring, and maybe what tools would you use for that? Which UX metrics would you focus on?
That's a good question. So if you're starting out, and we'll often see this if there's a very low maturity organization where you're thinking about measuring, and I think if we come back to where does one start measuring the user experience? If we go back to the metrics section here, I think I typically will start out and suggest what we know is we want to get some measure of ease and usefulness, And so going back to the UX Lite, it's an easy place to start at a broad level. So if an organization, for example, is already running surveys about their customers, what they think of the product, just including this in there as a retrospective account of how easy to use a product is, how useful they think it is, and we have published benchmarks to show you, is this above average? Do people think this is harder than usual? You can convert that into a SUS score. Is it higher usefulness or lower usefulness? It's a very easy to implement. You can put it on somebody else's survey. You can get quick measures. That's one way of doing it. The second way would be, the second level of measures there is certainly start at measuring beyond just, was there a problem in the interface? Yes or no, we uncovered a problem. It's what was the impact of the problem as the user was trying to complete a task. So I would start certainly here as well. Can users complete the task and measure that? Is it 50%? Is it 75%? How easy or difficult is that? And this works. What's nice, it works on prototypes, it works on fully functional software, SaaS software, it works on apps. So at the task level and the study level. So certainly UX Lite is a good way to get a broad measure. It's relatively cheap. The challenge with task level metrics is you need to start, if you're not running any usability testing, you need to start doing it. And for some organizations, it can be difficult to set up the product, a SaaS product, in such a way that it can be measured, in such a way that they can actually test it and finding those participants. But it's certainly going to be hard to find and fix problems if you can't do that. But once you've got that in place, simple measures at the task level, effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, and then overall the UX Lite. It's just 2 items. It doesn't take up much space at all. And you've got this measures of ease and you've got the measure of usefulness. And we know it connects to those other behavioral outcome measures like attitude to recommend and so forth. How's that?
I think it makes sense, and I guess in a way it's like, start small and then, take it from there.
Yeah, start small, because what you're basically doing is, if an organization doesn't have much UX measurement, what they are tracking though is revenue, profit, sales, new subscribers, new SaaS subscribers, for example. Those are the lagging measures. So you basically need to pick somewhere along here, knowing that there's a link. And some of these are easier to collect. So I mentioned those secondary lead measures as well. And then you've got these. So what will happen is task failure leads to people thinking that product is not easy to use. And that's why it ends up being in here. We've got usability, the UX Lite there, but the UX Lite. So good places to start.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Constantina. Thank you
Hi.
again for your time. I'm a UX researcher, qualitative UX researcher at Workable, same company as UXGreece. So my question would be, I mainly run qualitative research, so in-depth interviews and usability testing. And at the end of the usability testing, we'll usually incorporate the SaaS questionnaire. So my question today would be, what, or rather how, could I incorporate UX metrics effectively in my work to sort of complement what I already do?
So what are you measuring other than the SUS? Anything else in your interview?
No.
Nothing else. And are they task-based interviews? You're actually giving users tasks, or are you more asking them about attitudes towards things? Or
Usually attitudes, it would be exploratory mainly when we're looking into starting building a new feature or something like that.
yeah, and so I think it's quite common in in-depth interviews where it's primarily a qualitative outcome, and it's interesting that you're asking the SUS at the end because you still want to get some measure of how they think about the product, I guess, huh?
Yes, and this SaaS would be mainly for the usability testing that we're running.
The usability testing that you're doing. So are you interested in how you measure in the in-depth interviews or in the usability testing?
Both. If I could incorporate UX metrics somehow, I would be interested to learn.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly, like I mentioned, the UX Lite is helpful there. But what we find, I think, in in-depth, I mean, I guess I would say something, as much as we're quantitative and like to bring the quantitative methods to folks, you don't need to always quantify everything, despite, I think, sometimes the perception that we give. So there's always a role for qualitative research. But what's interesting is what we find is organizations want to extrapolate their findings from qualitative research and generalize it. Now, most qualitative researchers say, oh, well, this is not for generalizability, but that's exactly what's happening. We'll say, well, this is what some people said during our interviews, so this must be the case. One of the first ways that we help understand and work with this sort of mixed methods generalizability challenge is in an interview when participants mention things, even if it wasn't asked, we'll simply quantify the instances of how many people say something. So for example, when we were doing some interviews years ago on why users were not installing, downloading, and using a credit card app for a particular company. We were doing in-depth interviews first before a usability test. And it was a very open-ended dialogue. And in that process, a number of participants mentioned, in their own words, concerns about their data might get stolen in some way. They were concerned about privacy. And we're actually able to count the instances across users and then quantify that. So then the product team said, well, we heard a number of people say they were concerned about privacy. How important is that? We used that sample. We quantified the number of people, so you have a numerator and denominator. You can build a confidence interval around that, and you can say, this is a non-trivial issue. It's something like 20% of your user base, assuming the people we talk to are representative, see this as the main barrier. And it was important for them because they then invested more information on security messaging and so forth. And that came all out of an in-depth interview, a qualitative method. And that's showing how you're adding metrics. Now, are those UX metrics? They're sort of the precursor, if you will. Is there occurrence of something or not? And then certainly, as I mentioned to your colleague earlier, in your usability test, if you're already using the SUS, adding in task level metrics, completion rates, and ease are probably the two easiest things. Are people actually completing that versus not? It's a good place to start.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Jeff, I need your honest opinion on that. I need your longitudinal opinion. So let's talk about the maturity of the industry. Do the industry use the UX metrics enough, well, and do they use the outcomes of this study well enough? So it's a threefold question.
It's a good question. So my opinion on the maturity of the field in terms of using usability metrics, UX metrics, using it correct, we certainly work with a number of organizations in varying degrees of maturity, and I think we have a good representation here in this audience. So I certainly think we're at the very early stages of maturity. Some organizations, of course, systematically benchmark their products. They have these measures in at the task level. They have those measures at the study level. But those are, I think, the exception rather than the rule. So I think there's certainly a lot of room to go. I think probably the one thing I notice the most is a disconnect between how UX organizations collect the metrics and really what they do with them. What does this really mean? And what is extremely helpful, if you can do it, or we'll often do this statistically and it doesn't take a lot, is that example that I showed earlier with this. Linking your UX metrics to a business outcome suddenly makes your metrics very impactful, very meaningful. And I think that's the step that we don't see enough happening, and it can be made. And the reason why it's challenging is because these are almost always coming from different data sets. The revenue, the product data is owned by somebody else. It's in a different data set. The usability test data is controlled by the UX researchers, and so those two things don't often talk to each other. But this step of connecting UX metrics to business outcomes doesn't happen enough, and it can happen, even getting back to the net promoter score of that additional validation. I think that's an important step that can continue to happen. And the reason why it's important is because it helps set targets. Because with this organization, they knew they had to get at least above average for them to have at least a mildly successful phone not being returned there. And so if you're able to set those internal benchmarks, number one, measure, number two, connect it to particular outcomes, and then number three, set those thresholds, you're at that high level of maturity that very few organizations are at. So I'm hopeful we'll get there with our help too, maybe. We have a lot of room to get there. Yeah, I think it's hard to come up with these examples for those reasons. There's not a lot out there. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you very much for being with us here today. Your work is really, really inspiring, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts with us. I have a question about the administration of these rating scales and while you're measuring and usability in all these constructs you described, usability, usefulness, utility, all of these. Have you observed any particular impact in the way and in the means of administration? And what I mean by that is there any difference in validity and reliability when the rating scales are administered right after the usability test compared to, let's say, a survey, which is the distance between the usage and the actual scoring is potentially very, very big. Just giving extremes here. So have you observed any difference in validity and reliability in these situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it comes back to the challenge of measuring the user experience in general. So the idea is, if we come back to what is the user experience, it's this combination of attitudes and actions. So of course we use a product, we have an action, we form attitudes about that, but then as time goes on, those attitudes start to change and maybe fade a little bit. And we certainly do see that. We often will measure participants using what's called a retrospective account. So we'll recruit participants who say, we're just on a website purchasing a particular product in the last couple of months. Well, a month or two has gone by since they've used the website. How much do they remember? What happens? What we basically have found is there's generally a systematic increase in the measures when administered retrospectively. So a way to think about it is time starts to heal the wounds. Time is starting to heal the wounds. Now, not exclusively, but what we'll see though is we'll measure people in the moment using the exact same scale, and then another group of people after a week or 2 weeks or 2 months or 6 months, and the ratings tend to be higher. Systematically higher. We don't know how much higher, but they are systematically higher. Now, what that means is that our UX measures are not what are called invariant, so they're very susceptible to the context in which they're collected in. No different than when you collect a satisfaction score immediately after somebody calls customer support and the problem isn't solved. I mean, I'm gonna be very frustrated, I'm gonna be very mad if my problem wasn't solved. If I use that exact same scale right after somebody bought the product though, they're gonna be at the sort of peak satisfaction. They just purchased the product. It's the same scale, but because it's in a different context, now we have these particular challenges. Same thing here with retrospective accounts. It tends to be higher. It's a challenge when measuring. It doesn't mean you don't measure. It means when measuring retrospectively, be careful when making that comparison to something that's collected in situ. So knowing that that context will have that particular difference there. But now in terms of reliability and validity, what's interesting is when we measure the validity of our metrics, we'll use where we can both in context data that's collected after a study, as well as data that's collected in a survey. We'd like to have a few dozen people to get reasonable precision. But what we generally see is that there's comparable reliability in those cases. And then certainly the validity is easier to establish because if we saw a bad outcome, we had the measure, we can then make the connection a lot easier there. But yeah, I think it's the main challenge is that when you're gonna use things like the UX Lite in a survey or the SUS in a survey, it's gonna be more difficult to compare that to somebody collected directly after a usability test. It doesn't mean you can't, it means be careful. Same thing like when we're talking about cross-cultural comparisons with rating scales. It doesn't mean you can't use rating scales in multiple countries, it just means you're gonna have this confound. It often means equating it. Okay, do we have data to suggest that when we've collected it in the lab, it's substantially and consecutively always lower, and then you can adjust things potentially? Just much more complicated, yeah, it's good question.
Hi Jeff, this is Harry from Useberry, UX researcher. So you presented to us today, you talked about different studies around the L value. So I was wondering, you mentioned that data sets were given to these different evaluators. So I was wondering if the data sets refer to the same type of product, for example, system as a service, or a website, or an application, or an intranet, and if the L value differs based on the product type, and maybe based also on the type of person who is using the product. For example, on an intranet, you might have someone new, which is novice to the system, and someone who is expert to the system. So yeah, I was just wondering about the L values and the...
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, an important question. So if I can sort of rephrase it, in other words, this average of the problem occurrence, what products were used? Were they always the same products? Were they always the same people? And the answer is no, these varied substantially. Even within each paper, there were very different products that were used and even different user types. And I think that's an important caveat to using this particular formula is that it only applies in the context of the same users attempting the same tasks on the same interface. If you change any one of those three, you essentially now sampling from a different population and you now have to recompute each time. But that also leads to, I think, a lot of the confusion of why are people not uncovering problems as systematically as this formula would have us to believe. That's because in one case, different tasks were used. In another case, different users were used. In another case, a completely different system is being used. And so you're getting this vastly fluctuating value of P. Now, this is hard for the math, but it's very much the reality of what we deal with as UX researchers. We're constantly changing those things. And I think what it means is be careful about generalizing your problem occurrence to all your users, to all your tasks, to all your products, if you've only collected that data from one context with one set of users, one set of products, and one set of tasks. Change those and all sort of bets are off, if you will.
So the suggestion will be to test with multiple personas and aggregate that?
Well, that depends on the research question. And so certainly testing with more people that use your product is going to give you a broader sense of the particular problems you're going to have. So that's generally a good methodological approach, but don't do it just for the sake of the formula. What it means is if somebody says, well, how many users should we test? We're testing, say, teachers on this app, but we also have students. Well, don't expect that the problems you find from using teachers are necessarily going to uncover the problems that students would have. And we've seen this. It's like, well, there is some overlap, but it's a very distinct and different perspective on the same interface. And so, yeah, absolutely, testing in that case makes sense. But you would have a problem occurrence for teachers on that product. You'd have a separate problem occurrence for students, and that's why that formula will have different values each time. Because it could be that it's a lot easier for teachers, or what's often the case is it's a lot easier for experienced users than novice users. And that's even if it's the same persona, it could be a less experienced user in that persona group. That changes this formula well. And this is why it's sort of the mathematical model of UX research is so, it's challenging because there's so many of these variables that you're trying to measure. And I think it's unfortunate that some people will say, oh, look at all the weaknesses in your math, look at all the problems, let's throw the whole thing out and just listen to me, I'm an expert, or somebody might say that. And I think that's the wrong approach. There's things that we can learn from this. There's things that we can use from this, knowing the confines and the context in which it's collected and the limitations of it.
So would you test, I think this might apply to many people here. So you have a product and you want to test a specific journey, a specific goal that for users. And you want to test with 5 users, as Nielsen said.
Well, so, now I
You're
think
you're absolutely right, Joe.
Now, hang on a
You're
second.
absolutely right.
I want to make a qualification. Here's the problem. Now,
Saying what other people
Jacob
would
said
do.
a lot of things here, right? Jacob has said a lot of things. The problem is the title of his article is why you only need to test with 5 users. Now, that's a very strongly worded title and leads people to have one very strong opinion about something without necessarily reading it. Now, that's the title. So now you could say he didn't say it. The problem is he did say that. And this is where things get, there you go, the 93 paper, right. That's the qualification. Yes.
So who are these 5 users if you have multiple personas? Would you just conduct multiple rounds of testing? Would you mix them? I mean,
Yeah,
I can't test-
two thoughts on that. One, if the persona or the user type is distinct enough, yeah, you do. Like the students and teachers, the distinct. One thing that we noticed a lot when looking at organizations' personas, many of them are, there's a little bit of data driving those personas, but we'll often find there's very little difference in the behavioral outcomes of different personas. They're often segmented by age or gender or certain other attitudes, but when we actually measure them in the interface, they're acting almost indistinguishable from each other. So in those cases, if there's not a lot of behavioral differences between the personas, it's easier to justify not having to measure distinct ones, but I would be careful at the outset of not doing that unless you have data to suggest that they're similar.
I was thinking personas in terms of different needs and different utility within the same feature as opposed to segments.
Yeah, you would definitely want to use those 5 users for each one of those, at least 5 users, I guess. I think we have a question. Still have a question here? It can be a large question. I think we had a question still. Yep.
you need a microphone. Should we? Sorry? Yeah, let's proceed with this question because we have the other guys, expecting. So, Alessio from our online audience, he is asking, in the absence of established data for a thorough assessment of P, such as prior usability tests or evaluations based on user observations, could internal research methodologies like inspection techniques prove beneficial in evaluating preliminary version of P with the aim of refining it in the future?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the question becomes, and this was the challenge. This is almost always the challenge that when we're using these formulas is that nobody knows what the value. We don't know what the value is of P before we start testing. That is, we don't know how common the problems are. Again, if we knew there were problems, we'd go fix them. What's the point? So you're about to run a usability test. You need some value of P to justify your sample size. It's a chicken and egg problem. So I think the question is asking, can you use inspection methods to essentially establish some tentative value of P? I suppose you certainly could, and this gets at our recommendation, which is, as you look at an interface and know no one's ever tested this, no user's ever been through it, it's a brand new product, it's a brand new flow, it's much more likely P is going to be high than P is going to be low. So pick a value in that table that's that's in there. So when you're dealing with, so I guess building on the question, if you've inspected the interface and see, I think this is going to be problematic, you probably have higher values of P and therefore can get away with initial smaller sample sizes. Now, we've also done some interesting things. I didn't get into it too much today because it gets a little bit abstract, but another approach to estimating P and what others have done is after the first 2, 3, or 4, 5 users, you actually start to estimate the problem occurrence from what you're seeing. So you've measured 3 or 4, and then that'll tell you, okay, you've measured so many people, now you can estimate how common the problems are. The challenge is that what happens to that estimate from the first few people, it tends to be biased upwards because you're much more likely to see problems with the smaller sample size, larger problems with a smaller sample size. So there's adjustments and so forth. But there's an article on our website where we did find that there's this quadratic relationship between the number of problems found and the number of users. And so it's, if you can imagine a curve that goes like this, it starts to diminish, but it never goes down and it never flattens out. So there's this quadratic curve that you can use to help predict based upon the first few users in your group there. So it's one approach. Long answer to a reasonably long question too. So.
There's one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there is an effect regarding the cultural effect. You mentioned that there is a cultural effect that affects the scales, right?
Yes. Yep.
My question is this comparison happened with the same language or with translations? And if this cultural effect has an inner effect from the translation, and if we are making a study around multiple countries, should we use English, common language, or should we use the translated ones?
This is a great question. And when we are using rating scales, you've got 2 things to worry about. How the items are phrased, first in whatever the native language was, say if it was English, how well do those words translate to, say, French, to Greek, to Italian? Are certain things lost in translation, so to speak? The second thing is the mechanics by which that culture reads numbers on the scale and interprets the magnitude of those numbers and a certain aversion or predilection for certain numbers. Now, the process of validating a scale, like the system usability scale, like the Super Q, like the UX Lite, in another language, what you do is you start in English, you have somebody translate it into your target language, say Greek, and then you have somebody back translate that as a sort of a preliminary step. And then you see how well the back translation from a different person who translated back, how close it is to the original English or whatever you're starting from. That's step 1. Step 2 to actually validate, what you technically need to do is then administer that scale in the new language and then reestablish the reliability and validity measures that were established in the original language. So this has happened quite frequently with the system usability scale. I'm pretty sure there's a Greek version of that out there. Integrated doesn't work. Yeah, with the system usability scale, there's a number of words. This guy right here. A number of words from the original sus actually still have problems in English. So the word cumbersome was on the original wording, and we still, a number of people, even native English speakers, struggle what that word means. And so that's getting rephrased to awkward instead of cumbersome. But now, what you see, especially with multiple items, is the instrument can handle a little bit of loss in translation as things get averaged together. But to really know, the best thing to do is translate back, translate back. Now, the study we're talking about here with these particular cultural effects, we had it translated and then had it back translated back, and then we had those measures. So what we're basically seeing here, and it was with relatively straightforward phrases, but we also used public versions of the French sus, a German translated version of the sus. The Japanese one we had somebody translate, so there could still be potentially issues with that one. But the reliability was there and the validity was there. So what we're seeing here is definitely not the cultural effects from how the translation, it's the cultural effects from the mechanics of picking the numbers. Yeah. Yeah. You have anybody who can speak both languages first translate it, a separate person, then back translate it. Two people, different people. Well, you can have multiple people if you want to really be reliable. But the key thing is you don't have the same person, if you can, translate it back, because of course they would think it's the equivalent. But yeah, good question on that one.
Okay, it's on the same thing. When talking about cultural differences, it might be behavioral or expressional. So in UXGreece, we see a 10% scale, and we never grade it with 10 something. But our 9 is someone's 10 in other cultures. Are there any tools to normalize these differences so we don't lose data or misunderstand them?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think just to repeat a little bit what you're saying, same thing for what we basically saying what we found with especially our Japanese participants was a 9 or an 8 on a 10-point scale was one of the highest ratings that they would give. They're much more reluctant to give a 10, so everything was systematically rated lower. Now, I'm not aware of a sort of tool that's automatically going to be applied, but I suppose if there's enough data, you could see, do Greek respondents, for example, systematically rate the average 10% lower, 20% lower? My guess is it's going to be dependent on what's being asked and how much they're going to rate lower or higher. So what we do in these situations, if I was, say, a multinational company, say like Meta, that's got offices in multiple countries, but they want to know the ease of use of their product across those countries, what I would do is create a baseline in those countries to know, okay, everybody's responding the same way. So when we did this particular study, we had everybody in those countries rate their mobile phone carrier, because we knew everybody had a mobile phone, so they were all responding to the same experience. We also gave them a calibrated question of difficulty. So it was like a question out of a test, an intelligence test. It was called the Wonderlic. So everybody was responding to the same stimuli. One of the biggest challenges in international comparisons is when you want to say test the website of Facebook or in Greece, it's a different website than the website in the US, and it's a different website in Japan. So the actual interface itself is different. And now you're wondering, wait, are the differences that I'm seeing because people think the interface is worse? Is it because the translation was bad? Or is it because people are using this rating scale differently? So you've got all three things to worry about. And you could, of course, eliminate translation if you back translate it. But creating some sort of baseline and then calibrating it that way, unfortunately, is the only way I do it. I'm not aware of any tool that could systematically do it, certainly for all rating scales. Something to look into, though.
Okay, so we have another quick question. So it seems that we have some people that are really interested in this cultural aspect and the cultural effect that you mentioned here. And you briefly mentioned about USA, Germany, and Japan in data that we have. So the question is, are there any insights of findings about other countries, and especially about Middle East and Arabic cultures at this sense?
Great question, and I think, so if you go to our website and you just type in cultural effects, you can see the source for this. We also talk about it in the book. We have the questions, how they were phrased in English, how they were phrased in those languages, and the exact data that we use, first of all, so everyone can sort of see the source that came from that. We have a very limited number, I think is the very first thing to know, is now the cultural effects that we found are consistent with other published findings. So we weren't, of course, the first people to find this. It's a strong effect, so we've essentially corroborated that. But we do not have, I believe, anything specifically in the Middle East. However, we have seen this effect in many East Asian cultures, and the Middle East potentially could be one of those as well there. And I believe there's data published in that, but nothing that we have particularly done. But I would encourage, in the book also, when we talk about that, we cite numerous studies that reference particular cultural effects and rating scales. And it's worth looking into, certainly.
May I have the honor for the last question for the day? Okay. In a few minutes. Not the last.
Well, it depends on Jeff.
All right,
Yeah.
Dr. John, you got me.
Okay.
You got me.
Okay, how many hours? All right, okay. Well, probably the answer is a range, but I would like...
Of course, bring the beer.
Probably the answer is a range, but I'd like to ask you, I think I ask this question every year because the numbers change. So what is the good enough threshold for UX Lite on the scale? It used to, Nielsen at some point back in the day cited 80% of the scale. You've cited, I think, 70 something. Then you mapped it to the CGS. Jim says use a range. So I'm interested in what's the latest sort of higher and lower thresholds of the range.
Yeah, good question. So if we go back to, so this we can answer relatively quickly. So if we go back to the UX Lite, we are just now coming up with published benchmarks that people can use for the UX Lite. So what we're finding on both those scales, so what you're referencing is if you've got a rating scale and you don't know what is good or bad, and this touches back to the sort of the maturity question earlier as well. One of the biggest challenges I see is organizations will collect UX metrics, they'll see it, but then again, they'll want to know, well, they don't really interpret if something is good or bad. And so we have a number of these on our website for this particular reason. But what we're finding is if you convert your rating scale to a 100-point scale, now there's a method that you can do this on our website. It's just a little bit of algebra. You convert everything just like the SUS is on that 100-point scale. So the average of the historical average of the SUS is about a 68 across hundreds of products over the past 30 or 40 years, about a 68. So that's about 70% up the scale. When we've now got about 250 products that we've collected for the UX Lite, and it's something pretty similar on the E's. It's about a 72, 73. So this is so somewhere in the 70 to 73, 74% threshold of whatever your scale is suggests that's about the average that we're seeing. And you're right, we've seen before 70, 80%. Now, that's average. You don't want to necessarily aim for just average, as we saw with the handsets on the return rate. You actually want to be up at that higher range, and you saw that 80, the score of the 80 on the SUS and above, which is 80 percentile, or 80% is 80% of the maximum score, gets to that point. So you've got sort of one threshold, which is like average, which is probably around 72, 70%, 73%, and the average of good, which is probably more like 80% plus.
So it's a range.
Well, it's a range from this is somewhere in the range of it's good, and the reason why it's a range is because there is not a direct, clear connection between our sort of crude measures of attitude on the SUS and an exact behavior. So it's not like we can measure to the level of precision of like every single point is going to result in a substantial change. Just like we see with the SUS, we have those grades from A, B, and C. It encompasses a bit of a range of values in there. Yeah, we can keep talking about that.
I know it's late, but beers is being distributed.
Beer's here.
Yeah, so very quickly, I'm going to open this kind of worms about the interpretation of interval and ordinal scales. you write a lot of stuff about Stephen's work and Mitchell's work as well, and the orders of magnitude. Like your high-level thoughts on the best arguments of this, like for and against this, and where you stand about this particular subject and how they're.
Yeah, a good one to go into the beers. That's a good one. So I think, yeah, the beers and drugs. So, so briefly, one of the controversies, if you will, about rating scales is, can you really or should you take a mean value of a rating scale? You have a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale or 11-point scale. You can take the average, but should you? What do those values really mean? And you go back almost 100 years ago, and the researcher by the name of S.S. Stevens, who was deriving things out of psychophysics, made the argument that the level of measurement that you use should dictate the sort of computation that you do on your data. And Stevens argued that unless data is at least what's called interval or ratio, you shouldn't even be using the particular average, and instead you should use a frequency distribution or the median. So now, so just really quick on that terminology, interval data, so when you have a rating scale like a 5-point scale, there's discrete values between there. So right, the value, the difference between a 1 and a 2 is the same as a 2 and a 3 and a 3 and a 4. It's one step. Now, the numeric value is there, but how people interpret that might not be linear throughout. As we've been talking about, people might respond slightly differently depending on where you're on that scale, which means that these rating scales often don't have equal intervals in usage. The problem with that is that as we start to make those interpretations, we'll make statements that require sort of interval level measurements. What I mean by that is, if we have a rating scale and we have an average of 4 on one rating scale, 4 out of 5 on one product, and then we have another rating scale and we get a 2 on that product, so 4 and 2, it's getting late. If my math is right, that's twice the value of the other. Now, if it's a satisfaction scale, what will happen is we'll look at that and say, oh, the value on one satisfaction scale is a 4, the value on another satisfaction scale is a 2. Those people are twice as satisfied as these other people. So what I'm doing there is I'm making what's called a ratio statement. It's two times the value. The problem is that's not necessarily true. The value of 4 is certainly double that of 2, but the quantity that it represents in users' mind is not necessarily double the value. And that's where I would agree with Stevens that we have to be careful. We can't use the language, that precise language, to say our users are twice as satisfied, or we think they think it's twice as usable. The mean is twice as high, and I think it's certainly permissible. The numbers don't know where they came from. You can take the mean. Well, you have to be careful. We can't say like a temperature is twice as hot as another temperature in the same way. We can't use that same language when we're talking about rating scale unless you get to that ratio type level. Now, the problem is very few measures in user experience are ratio level. We would have to have things like time on task, which is ratio level. So, and the reason why this is the pragmatic aspect of this is Stevens and others would say, don't use the mean, instead use the median. And the problem with the median on a multi-point scale is you'll often have this bizarre mechanics happening in such a way that you can have two values that will have identical medians, but then they'll be statistically different in some cases. This actually happened to Jim when he was learning. You'll have a certain statistics teachers that get very rigid on how you use rating scales. Even to this day, they'll see a rating scale. Oh, you can't use the mean. You can't compute a standard deviation. Heaven forbid you can't compute a confidence interval like you did. Well, of course you can. We've done it. But the question is, how does one interpret that? And the place that we have to be careful is not making those statements twice as satisfied, twice as easy to use, like we can in saying twice the time. It took people twice the time. And so we're okay. There's this middle ground, and we talk about that in quantifying the user experience. There's a middle ground where we respect the Stevens thresholds of ratio and interval in our interpretation, but we're not as rigid to say we can't compute means and confidence intervals. We disagree with that. How's that for a good ending there? You absolutely can compare the satisfaction, but be careful if you were to say the satisfaction increased by 50% or 20%. The score increased by 20%, but is that really? Well, the numbers could be significant, but is the user satisfaction really 50% higher? Is it really twice as high? That's much harder to make that statement unless that scale's been calibrated in such a way, and very few have been. You could say it's more, absolutely. You could say the satisfaction score is definitely higher. It's statistically higher. And you could even say the satisfaction score is 2 points higher, or 10 points higher, or the satisfaction score is 20% higher, or the satisfaction score is twice as high, because we're talking about the score. Where Stevens and other academics get really mad is when we're trying to ascribe that specifically to the attitude that we're trying to measure. And we're much more practical in UX research. It's like, does this lead to better decision making over time? And we find using the mean and making those comparisons is better than using the median over time on those rating scales, definitely.
One really quick question.
Sure.
Last one.
Ask this once a lifetime. Science versus industry. So thinking about NPS and Sanelli's score, market product fit score, do you think that the pace of the scientific publications process keeps up with the industry needs? Do we have enough UX metrics and instruments? So is the industry's fault that they are not using them, or we are not covering their needs, actually? What's your thoughts on that?
You know, that's a great question, and I think it's a common challenge. It also speaks to one of the main reasons why we do what we do at Measuring You is the reason why there often is such a disconnect between the measures organizations do or don't do in the publications is that it can be quite challenging to get permission from an organization to release their data to be published. Now, we're able to do that. We pay for it, we collect it, and we publish it. And that's part of why we do what we do. And so when you buy books and reports on our website, a lot of that goes to fund our research. Sometimes too much, but we enjoy the craft and the art of actually measuring. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is why we see that disconnect is you'll get an academic source of data that's maybe student-led or from as opposed to something that's actually happening much more frequently in industry there. Certainly something that's leading to maybe a little bit of a lag, but what Jim and I really hope to do and continue to do is keep the findings in publications and try to apply it, replicate it where we can, and also get it out a lot more frequently than I think publications take a while. Just from the publication cycle, sometimes things take a year or two. But if we see a strong claim made or an interesting claim made, or we'll see new scales get mentioned all the time, we're like, oh, let's try that out. Let's replicate that. What we often find is we can replicate things, or in other cases we find it's very similar to other measures, and so you don't need to switch things. But you know, our hope is certainly to continue to bridge that gap. So, good question.
Jeff Sauro. Thank you so much. We need to get you to your appointment. So, if you have a moment that stood out for you, make a LinkedIn post, hashtags UXGreece. Sorry. And you might have a chance to win this book, the latest one.
Brought all the way from Denver, one copy of Serving These Experiences, way down the bag. It's in my carry-on. It was very heavy, so
You've been great. Thank you.